So currently, the Fed is doing quantitative easing to the tune of 120 billion per month, which a lot of people would argue that's why the stock market has just gone up to nosebleed levels. And it's why we see a lot of the insanity that we see today in the S&P, the NASDAQ, et cetera. Well, if Janet spends, let's say, 250 billion a month, that's going to be an additional 250 billion of QE on top of the 120 that they're already doing. So that's going to be $370 billion worth of QE every month.
Hey, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome my good buddy George Gammon back to the show, and he's been doing a little dancing, learning the twist. And not that kind of stuff, but the Federal Reserve has been doing some dancing. And, back around, I don't know, maybe 2011, they were trying to find more creative ways to print fake money out of thin air. It's always what it boils down to in some way. Right. And they did something called Operation Twist. And George says there's a new version of this happening. So George, can you give us a history lesson? You're so great at that. Tell us what the original Operation Twist was and what's going on now.
Sure. Well, the Fed has what they call, we'll call them quote unquote assets on their balance sheet. Those are usually mortgage-backed securities or treasuries. And these treasuries can be different. Some of them can be what we call T-bills, which may mature in 3 months, a month, something like that. So short term. And then others may be very long term, what we call notes or bonds. So 10-year or 30-year treasuries. And so with Operation Twist, what they do is they try to buy the long-dated treasuries to try to bring down the yield curve. In other words, bring down interest rates in the real economy. So let's think about mortgages. If mortgages are loosely tied to the 10-year treasury, if they can artificially bring the yield down or the interest rates on 10-year treasuries, effectively, they're going to bring the interest rates down on mortgages. Or that's kind of the goal, right? So what they did at the time is they actually didn't want to print more bank reserves, believe it or not. So they sold some of their short-term treasuries, some of the T-bills, and they bought some of those longer-term treasuries. So they're trying to get the yield curve down, get those interest rates down in the real economy without having to create any new bank reserves or expand the size of their balance sheet on net balance. So that was back in, I don't know if that was 2010, 11, right around there. But now they're considering doing it again. And they haven't outright come out and just admitted it. But Janet Yellen is in charge of the Treasury now. And the Treasury has an account with the Fed. It's a checking account, just like the primary dealer banks have. And it's just like your checking account that you have at Bank of America or Wells Fargo, except that it's not at a commercial bank, it's with the Federal Reserve. So this TGA is the checking account, if you will, for the Treasury. What happens when they collect taxes or they sell bonds at auction, all the funds, the proceeds go into the TGA. And then when they write stimmy checks,
Stimmies. I love the new lingo we're getting, George. Stimmies.
Yeah, or bottom line is when they spend money back into the economy, that check is written and when it's deposited, it's deducted from the TGA. There's a bit of a difference there because it's creating a bank liability, a commercial bank deposit, and that's a liability of the commercial banking system. So it has to be matched up with an offsetting asset. So the asset are the bank reserves going from the TGA into XYZ bank wherever the check was deposited. But that kind of takes us down a rabbit hole. Bottom line is the TGA prior to the GFC would usually float around $4 billion, $4 billion with a B, as far as the balance. Pretty much when the money came in, the government would go ahead and spend it, and it was just kind of kind of this revolving door. What happened?
I have the feeling you're about to share a giant number with us that's much more giant than 4 billion, but go ahead.
Yeah, now it's 1.6 trillion.
Oh my God.
So we'll go right to the punchline. I was going to tell you what happened between the GFC and now, but that's
go ahead. Yeah.
Well, with Obama, he took it up to about 200 billion. Trump took it up to about 400 at one time, over a trillion. And now Janet Yellen is sitting on $1.6 trillion. So why is this important? It goes back to what I was saying when the Treasury, when Janet sends Mr. Hartman a stimmy check, then what?
I don't get a stimmy check. I feel so left out.
Yeah, you can go on TikTok and show the world. But let's say that you get, or XYZ person gets a check. Again, they deposit it at their Wells Fargo. So then the bank reserves, the offsetting asset, has to go from the TGA, which is the account they have with the Fed, to the Wells Fargo account with the Fed. So there's an offsetting asset to match that liability, the check that you just deposited at your local bank. So let's think this through. Janet Yellen has come out and said that she's going to draw down the TGA by $1.1 trillion.
Okay.
Over the next 4 months. Okay. So you say, why? Maybe she doesn't want to issue any more new bonds at auction. I doubt she understands the situation thoroughly. So she's just thinking, okay, we got 1.6. Why not just spend it instead of having to issue more bonds at the auction? I mean, it just makes sense, right?
Right.
Why borrow more when we've got 1.6 trillion in our checking account? The problem here is that when she spends, let's say, $1 trillion, that means two things. Number one, there's going to be $1 trillion of additional bank reserves in the commercial banking system. And number two is that's going to increase M2 money supply by $1 trillion in, let's say, 4 months. So let's focus on the bank reserves first and foremost. If we think about quantitative easing, all that is the Fed printing up bank reserves to buy treasuries or mortgage-backed securities from the commercial banks themselves. That's what a lot of people call printing money. That's base money. So if we think that, okay, quantitative easing has made the stock market go up in the past, and it kind of distorts the financial economy as far as price signals, during QE3, which was just an unfathomable amount of quantitative easing, that was about 85 billion per month. Currently, because of what I call the cerveza sickness, because of the
which we all love, that
yeah. So currently, the Fed is doing quantitative easing to the tune of 120 billion per month, which a lot of people would argue that's why the stock market has just gone up to nosebleed levels. And it's why we see a lot of the insanity that we see today in the S&P, the NASDAQ, et cetera. Well, if Janet spends, let's say, 250 billion a month, that's going to be an additional 250 billion of QE on top of the 120 that they're already doing. So that's going to be $370 billion worth of QE every month for the next 4 months. So why is that a big deal? Well, and let's just set aside the M2 money supply. So there's more currency units, $1 trillion more currency units in the real economy chasing goods and services, while, as you know, the supply of stuff is decreasing. Therefore, it's going to put a lot of pressure on consumer prices. But what happens is the banks that now have these additional bank reserves, they don't really like to just keep them at the Fed because they don't get much of an interest, a couple basis points at that. So they like to buy T-bills, those short-term treasuries we were talking about, because through a process called rehypothecation, which is bananas in itself, they can, the bottom line, I won't go into that, but they can make more money by holding T-bills than they can by holding bank reserves. So
right. I heard a lot of complaints about that. The banks are basically playing the arbitrage, right? And is that the reason that not enough of this money trickled down during the Great Recession, and maybe that's happening now too? It's a Cantillon thing, right? Where the people close to the money are hoarding the money.
Kind of. Yeah, I would argue that it's just a simple risk reward equation for the commercial banking system. So would you increase the size of your balance sheet to create a loan to XYZ entrepreneur in the real economy when you just got done with the GFC, interest rates are at zero, everything around you is telling you that the economy is shaky at
right.
best? Or do you take that balance sheet capacity and go into the repo market, rehypothecate, just create derivatives? This is something in the financial economy. The risk reward is better for them to keep that balance sheet capacity in the financial economy.
Of course. I understand why they're doing it. I'm just saying, kind of coming from the perspective of, isn't the whole point of all these programs is that
the whole point
ostensibly it's supposed to help the people, right? And it's helping the banks.
Because it's supposed to help people by bringing down interest rates in the real economy, increase spending, and do all these things that Keynesian economists think are fantastic.
Right.
But going back to those bank reserves, so what this does is this creates a massive amount of demand for these T-bills, which is why if you look at the yield curve, or if your listeners have been watching CNBC or Bloomberg, they always talk about the yield curve really steepening. So the 10-year and the 30-year rates are going up dramatically, while the short end of the curve, the rates aren't going up at all. They're still almost pegged right at zero. And the market is doing that, even more so than the Fed, because there's so much demand for those. So just for clarification, if there's demand for those T-bills, the price goes up. If the price of a bond goes up, the interest rate goes down. The problem we're coming into now is that we could have a situation where there's so much demand for these T-bills because of what Janet Yellen is inadvertently doing, that the interest rates on the short end of the curve go negative. So you'd have this bizarre situation where a 3-month T-bill would be trading at a negative interest rate, while a 10-year Treasury, the interest rate would be going up at the same time.
Yeah.
So this causes a lot of problems for hedge funds, a lot of issues. I'll just put it at that. It's one thing for a German Bund to go negative, or a JGB, which is the Japanese debt. It's a whole other ballgame for American U.S. Treasuries to go negative, even at the short end of the curve. Although
and is that just because the U.S. has the biggest economy and the most influential central bank, or is there another reason for that? And the reserve currency too, of course.
Yeah, and the Treasury can't issue new debt at negative yields, so it gets really weird. And a lot of these sovereign wealth funds have these on their balance sheet. A lot of the hedge funds are what we call risk parity, so they're levering up to buy these bonds. So if the interest rate goes negative, I don't even know how that plays out. It's a precarious situation at the very least, right? So I don't think the Fed is going to want the interest rates to go negative for a sustained period of time with these T-bills. So number one, they're probably going to call up Janet Yellen and say, what the hell are you doing? What are you thinking? I'm sure that JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are going to have her on speed dial saying, you don't understand what you're doing right now. Stop.
Yeah.
But then the other thing, as takes us back to our original topic, the Fed can do is Operation Twist 2.0.
Right.
Because the Fed has some of these T-bills on their balance sheet. So what they can do is they can sell the short-term T-bills. If they sell them, that creates more supply. If we have more supply, theoretically, the price goes down, therefore the interest rate goes up. So they have this mechanism that they could try to employ to bring those short-term interest rates up above negative if they dip down. Now, the problem here is the Fed only has about 300 billion worth of these T-bills on their balance sheet. So after they sell those, they're done. And if the problem still exists, then it could hit the fan. And then they'll buy the long end of the curve because at some point, interest rates will get high enough to where they, number one, affect the stock market dramatically, which was what we saw in 2018. And number two, they start affecting the real economy. I mean, you can imagine what would happen if interest rates, quote unquote, normalized and mortgage rates went from 3% to say 10%. That would be very detrimental. So they'll probably come out and do what we call yield curve control,
right?
Like they did in the 1940s after World War II.
Sure.
They basically capped long-term interest rates and bought as many bonds as they needed to make sure the interest rates did not go above a certain level on the 10-year, therefore the real economy.
George, that begs the question, the interest rates are artificially low. They've been that way for a long, long time, especially in the last year. What do you think is the real or the natural interest rate for, say, a 30-year home mortgage? Maybe nobody knows because the market's so manipulated, right?
Yeah, wow. I can tell you where historically it's been. I mean, historically, mortgage rates are right around 6-7%, something like that. That would be going back to, I'm just trying to think of a chart I've used in one of my videos, probably going back to, the late 1800s. It would be right around that number. I think 7, 8, something like that.
Yeah. So what does this all mean? As you're talking, I'm thinking this is all sounding inflationary.
Yeah.
Do you concur with that?
Yeah, because if we take a step back and think through the process of Janet Yellen spending the 1.1 trillion, it's not only going to increase the amount of bank reserves in the system, which is what we just talked about, but it's also going to increase the amount of deposits in the commercial banking system, because she's spending an extra $1 trillion and people are going to cash those checks. They're going to deposit those checks. So that means we've got an extra $1 trillion worth of currency units that are in the economy chasing goods and services. And if we look at the unemployment rate, which I think is understated, but then we think about how many businesses have gone bust during the lockdowns 2020 and what we're seeing now, and how many of those businesses are not coming back when we look at supply chain disruptions. And then we think through the average income of an American going up significantly during the same time at which there's very high unemployment and we have a reduction in goods and services. I mean, there are no certainties, but you would have to argue that the probabilities of consumer price inflation, I'm not talking about asset price inflation, but consumer prices, the stuff you buy every day, going up significantly in 2021. And I think it would come as a surprise for most of your listeners and viewers to understand how much incomes have actually gone up. They haven't just stayed the same due to these stimmy checks and increased unemployment benefits. But as an example, in January of 2021 alone, average income, if you just took an aggregate total of the United States, went up by 10%. 10% in 1 month. That is a staggering number. I mean, if we had you go back to the Industrial Revolution and we didn't see anything even remotely close to that type of economic boom, if you will. If you're a Keynesian, you just look at the aggregate demand. And then going back to 2020, the numbers get even more staggering.
Right.
And this is from the government's own website. I did some research on this the other day. So it was the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And they did a study showing that they actually did state by state, which is really fascinating. But then they took an average of all the states. And incomes from Q1 of 2020 to Q2 of 2020 went up by over 30%. Over 30%. Did you, in the state of Massachusetts, Jason, they went up by over 70%. 70.
Unbelievable.
I mean, just think about that.
Okay, but what part of the income distribution spectrum is that? I mean, that's certainly not true of low-level workers.
Yeah.
Well, what? Tell us.
Yeah, because they're getting this stimulus money, and the people who are unemployed, going back to 2020, are making more money being unemployed than they were working.
Right. Talk about bad incentives, yeah.
Yeah, so you incentivize people to not go to work. And, some people could argue that's good because of health reasons. I'm not going to get into that debate. But the bottom line is if people aren't working, there's less stuff, period. And if incomes go up by 30% and the amount of stuff goes down by 30%, you pretty much got one way for consumer prices to go. And also,
right. But George, hang on, just expand on that a little bit. That's a super important point. So, obviously limited supply of goods and services, increased supply of currency units equals inflation. And
consumer price inflation,
consumer price inflation, but certainly we've seen tons of asset price inflation too, but that's of course a slightly different topic. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of people are taking this money and going into GameStop or just speculating, becoming Wall Street gamblers, really.
Or they're buying a new house. Or
I was going to say they could be using it as a deposit to buy a new house as well. But we talked about the income side of the equation, but we also need to think through the expense side of the equation when you have a rent moratorium and you have a mortgage forbearance. So people's incomes go up by 30%, but their expenses go down by, let's say, 50% if they're spending 50% of their income on there.
And the savings rate has just skyrocketed. We've seen that.
And that's why you see the savings rate go up. But that's also why you see the trade deficit go to the moon, which no one's really talking about except for Schiff. And so what's happening is because we're not creating, we weren't really making anything before. But now we're really not making anything. And so where do we have to get the stuff we actually buy? We have to import more and more and more and more. And that's why you see the trade deficit just skyrocketing.
Yeah, wow. So tell us more about what this means to us and that earlier statement you made about the Fed and the inner workings of the Fed and Yellen's, all the action she's taking. You said, well, it could hit the fan. What does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, if this affects these huge hedge funds that have focused on a risk parity strategy, and I'm not an expert enough to know, what their balance sheet looks like or what their portfolio looks like and how much this would or would not affect them. But if it did significantly affect them, then you're talking about pension funds. Because, let's use Bridgewater as an example. Bridgewater is the largest hedge fund on the planet Earth.
Sure. Yep.
So you're going to have a lot of pension funds that are going to have a substantial portion of their capital invested with a strategy that could be heavily reliant upon treasuries having a positive yield or at least a zero yield. Once they go negative, it really throws a wrench into the engine or into the gears. Potentially. And I want to be very clear. I'm not an expert on hedge funds or risk parity strategy. So I don't know if this would just be maybe a little speed bump or it could be something catastrophic.
So what does catastrophic or even a speed bump look like, though? What does that mean? What do we see as us common folk out in the world?
A speed bump would be something like the repo spike that we saw in 2019 in September, where it was a huge deal, but it only lasted a couple of days, and most Americans didn't know.
And you were one of the few people really reporting on that, by the way. Yeah. You did an awesome job. And, if you typed in repo market, you'd see George Gammon right there.
Yeah. As far as for the geeks who are really into the financial plumbing and the monetary system, it was a pretty big deal. But for everyone else, they didn't even notice. As far as, something catastrophic, I mean, you're looking at the GFC, something like that.
The global financial recession.
Yeah.
The global financial crisis, the Great Recession.
Something like that.
13 years ago.
Although if you had kind of a domino effect like that now, the outcome would be far worse without the intervention of the Fed and the government, because the debt is so much higher on the consumer balance sheet, on the corporate balance sheet, on the sovereign balance sheet, at the state level. I mean, pretty much everywhere you look, people have more, people and entities have much more debt now than they had back in 2008. So that would add a lot of gunpowder, let's say,
Right.
to the explosion.
Are those, when you're talking about those debt numbers, you see all this stuff out there. I look at all these charts all the time. You do too. Are those debt numbers adjusted for inflation? When you say that, or so that's real debt then?
Yeah, a lot of times they're a percentage of GDP.
Yeah. Okay.
So
interesting.
You kind of get a better apples to apples comparison there. Now, why is the consumer balance sheet so leveraged? Most likely because housing prices go up. I mean, a lot. Pretty much, if you look at the consumer balance sheet, I think and I haven't done this, but I would imagine it's pretty consistent with housing prices. So, in other words, when housing prices go up, the consumer debt to GDP goes up as well.
Yeah. So that means people are buying a new house. The new house has a bigger mortgage. But the important thing to know about that, and I don't think it's quite as dire as one might think hearing that on the surface, because that debt service payment is actually cheaper because of the artificially low interest rates, which can't last forever.
Yeah, they can't, but they can last a very long time, and a lot longer than most people would assume. Just using that concept of things that seem insane and things that are obviously manipulated. They're not a market action.
Right.
What's the saying? The market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent type thing. And that is very, very true. I think if you would have asked anybody in 2020, the government is going to have $5 trillion in deficit spending, which, by the way, so they're going to increase their debt by $5 trillion, which, just to put into context, from 1776 to 1996, seriously, 220 years, the United States government accumulated $5 trillion in debt in 220 years.
Yeah.
And we accumulated that much debt just in 2020.
And those 220 years had multiple wars, crises, Spanish flu. I mean.
Yeah, so just staggering stuff. Yeah. And so if you would have given some metrics like that, people would say, oh, well, there's no way that it can last. It can't survive. You can't keep kicking the can that far down the road. But sure enough, here we are.
I believe they can kick that can down the road for quite a bit longer, actually. So do I.
So do I. One of the things that brought me to that conclusion, I was just going through that tweet storm from Michael Burry.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yeah, the recent one, right?
Yeah, where he was talking about hyperinflation. Yep. He actually referenced my good friend Lynn Alden, one of her charts and her appearance on Macro Voices, and what she was talking about, very similar to what we're saying, where if the Fed just buys assets, it's really not inflationary. It's not creating currency units in the real economy. But when the Fed monetizes the debt directly, that's creating more currency units, kind of similar to the process we talked about before. And Burry reiterated that on Twitter. But he also mentioned a book that he was reading called Dying of Money. And it's an in-depth analysis on the Weimar Germany hyperinflation, in addition to the inflation we had in the United States in the 1970s. And so,
which was nothing compared to Weimar, Zimbabwe, Hungary, or anything else, or Argentina, right? But yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, but it was, the seeds were sown many years in advance. So if we think about the Weimar Germany situation, their real inflation, where they're going around with wheelbarrows full of cash and stuff, that was really within about a year, 1923. And then 1922 is when you really started to see some inflation. That created what we call Gresham's Law. So you can imagine if all these foreigners that own dollars right now, if the dollar was depreciating by 50% per year, those dollars would most likely come back to the United States to buy anything, that was a hard asset.
And the reason is because if the dollar was depreciating, people would want to exchange the dollar for something real.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
So that's Gresham's law, where the bad money chases out the good.
Right.
Basically. So that would create more currency units circulating. That would create higher velocity, and that would just take the inflation to the next level, which it did in Weimar Germany. But the whole point there is going back to 1914. That's when they went off the gold standard. That's when they really started to print money for World War I. So it started in 1914. The seeds were being sown, but you saw the result or the effect of that in 1923. So call it 9 years, 10 years later.
The lag time. Yeah.
Give some context there so people understand how dramatic it was from 1914 to 1918, where they didn't really see too much of a move, relatively speaking, in consumer price inflation. So from 1914 to 1918, they saw combined prices doubled. You say, well, that's a lot, George. Yeah, but if you look at it on an annual basis, it's only about 15% per year, very consistent with what we had in the 1970s here in the United States. But M2 money supply increased 9 times.
Wow.
9 times. So they increased their money supply by 60% per year.
That's just incredible.
But consumer prices only went up by 15%. So what happened is this lulled them into this idea that, well, what's the problem here? If we're creating all these additional currency units and all this additional demand, and the only price we have to pay is an additional 15% of goods and services on net balance, that's a huge win.
Right. We might as well keep doing it.
Might as well keep doing it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So they kept doing it. And to the point where what really lulled them to sleep, which was the straw that broke the camel's back, was between 1920 and 1921, the end of 1921, the mark, the German Reichsmark, which was their currency unit, appreciated against the dollar. It went up in value.
Why would that happen? Why? How?
Because their economy was booming.
Okay.
They were an export powerhouse. They were doing, the economy was on fire.
Yeah.
And so their currency, a lot of demand for the currency. So from that almost 2-year period, if you look at a chart from 20 to 21, the end of 21, the dollar went down in value against the Reichsmark. The Reichsmark went up in value. Yeah. Just a mere year, not even a year, a mere 6 months before they started using the Reichsmark as toilet paper.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was going to say kindling, but it was actually used in the fireplace to produce heat because the heat you could extract from the money was more valuable than the money, or I should say currency.
Let me give you another shocking statistic.
Yeah.
Okay. At the end of, I believe it was 1921, and it's all in this book, and you can download it free on the internet. It's fantastic.
And by the way, I want to tell you about the book. So you can also buy it on Amazon. Speaking of inflation, it's $494 for the hardcover, but you can get the paperback for $49. It does not have very good reviews either, but anyway.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Okay. That's it for right there, folks, in the
I've
video.
been reading it. Yeah. It's awesome. So
you like it?
I believe it was 1922. So at the beginning of 1922, there were 190 billion worth of Reichsmarks in existence. So there are 190 billion Reichsmarks. Okay. That was all the Reichsmarks in the entire planet Earth, right? At the end, 1 year later, it would have taken that many Reichsmarks to buy a newspaper.
That's just unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. It's absolutely incredible, the stories you hear out of the Weimar history. Do you know the one, George, about the man that was trying to go into a market and he had his wheelbarrow full of currency, right, of marks, and he couldn't get the wheelbarrow through the door? And someone came along and dumped the money out but ran away with the wheelbarrow because that was more valuable.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's take that back to today. Why does that matter, George? Well, number one, to your point, things can last a lot longer while these seeds are being sown. And let's remember that the money supply was increased at the beginning when this hyperinflation was brewing. The money supply was being increased by, call it 50, 60% per year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to remind everyone, in 2020 alone, the United States money supply was increased by 25%. So I understand 25% isn't 50, but it's damn close.
But so that would indicate inflation is coming, and a lot more people are starting to talk about that. I've noticed people that I respect.
But it could be 5 years down the road. It could be, these things take a long time to play out.
Sure, and we've also got to remember that, of course, famous last words. This time it's different. I mean, the U.S. has the reserve currency. Germany did not.
But Grecian law still kicks in.
Good money chasing out bad.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Anything else you want to wrap this up with, George?
No, that's it, man. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's always great to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, any action steps? How about a quick action step on this? What are you going to say there?
Make sure you got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Yeah.
own a little bit of gold, own Bitcoin if that's your thing, and make sure you got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Yeah. And I agree with that all too well. George, give out your website.
It's just georgegammon.com. And people, if they just Google me, they can find my YouTube channel. It's George Gammon. Find me on Twitter. It's Gammon.
Good stuff. George Gammon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, buddy.